There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Bookmaniac. Welcome back to my channel and to another episode of Zooming In, an occasional series, not that occasional, fairly regularly, actually. But having such a good time doing it, of conversations with bookish social media luminaries the world over about various bookish and literary articles online. And boy, this is going to be a fun one. But first of all, speaking of fun, here's my interlocutor, Mikiko, joining us from Halifax. Hello, Mikiko.
Hi, Shawn. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
You do not need to have watched the video that Mikiko and I recently did that's gone up on this my channel a few days or weeks ago, but it might be a good idea because it's such a great conversation. Mikiko read some of my 5-star reads this year, and we had a wrap-up conversation about the books that she liked, and 2 of them are relevant to this discussion. So this is a transcript of a conversation between 2 of the writers that Mikiko read because I read them. So 2 writers that are important to both of us.
Yeah.
Those writers are the Japanese writer Yuko Tsushima and the French writer Annie Ernaux, who last year won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And the interview was called Passion for Living in the Present. Conversation with Yuko Tsushima and Annie Ernaux by Lisa Hofmann-Kuroda, and I believe she is the translator. This transcript had originally been published in a Japanese literary journal and had kind of languished in obscurity. Most Japanese people didn't even know it existed until quite recently. And now it's available on LitHub, where it was published in April, and Mikiko and I have read it, and I'm going to turn it over because I've been talking for about 17 minutes trying to set this up here. Mikiko, what did you make of this?
Well, I thought it was really interesting because, of course, when we were chatting about your 5-star reads, we talked about how both happening. So this is one of your 5 stars that I read. And then also, I don't have the book because I read it as an ebook, but Women Running in the Mountain by Yuko Tsushima kind of paired nicely and unexpectedly while I was reading the 2, especially because they both deal with pregnancy and the idea of motherhood and just kind of thinking about what that entails and how they're going to move into motherhood or not, of course, because of, Annie Ernaux's story is not about that, but they did play nicely off of each other. And then you found the article, which was great. I thought it was an interesting conversation, because it's translated, right? So, Yuko Tsushima is speaking in Japanese, Ernaux is speaking in French, and then they have, somebody who's translating for them. And I believe actually it was Ernaux's translator who had translated happening into Japanese, who was translating their conversation.
I think that's true, yes.
Yeah, right? I kind of wondered, maybe what in the conversation might have gotten lost or maybe misunderstood, because there were kind of points where they were slightly disjointed, but overall I found the conversation really interesting, especially considering that they are both big fans of one another's work. And of course they could compare their experiences based on, where they're from and their experiences in the literary world, but then also how those differ, because of course there are some major differences that they talk about as well. So I thought it was quite an interesting article. They were talking about the idea, at least initially, of both of them writing about everyday things and how they both focus on, making that the subject matter of their work and also the reception of that, which I thought was interesting.
This discussion between Yuko Tsushima and Annie Ernaux happened in Tokyo in 2004. So it's that far back. Sadly, Yuko Tsushima died. She was not very old. So
no, not old at all.
She passed. It was when I was living in Tokyo, and she was not on my radar at all at that time. I discovered her about 3 or 4 or 5 years later.
I wrote it down. She died in 2016.
2016. Okay, 16. Thank you.
No worries.
It was after I moved to Tokyo 2009. She died in 2016, and I discovered her like literally the next year. I wasn't aware of her at all when she was alive.
Oh, that's a shame. Yeah, I hadn't heard of her either, which maybe goes to show where her place is in the Japanese literary canon, or the lack of her place there, which I thought was interesting. I like the conversation about the everyday things, because it kind of becomes what mothers and what women are dealing with in the day-to-day, and just talking about things that maybe don't seem extraordinary, yet when you think about motherhood, for example, with Yuko Tsushima, she's writing about dirty diapers, and they mention this, and changing a diaper, and and how that may or may not be pertinent to this character's life. There seems to be quite a lot of flack, which I thought was interesting, because both writers note male writers, and men have made comments about that. And for Yuko Tsushima, she's told that her work is profiting off of the death of her son, which I thought was quite odd to say, one, but also very presumptuous. And then, when in the article, Annie Ernaux talks about a French writer, I think it's Tanya.
I'd never heard of that writer.
Never heard of him either. And how he asks her, can you please write about something else other than sanitary pads and cleaning floors? And I thought, hold on a minute. Like, if this is women's lives, how do you just glaze over that? I just thought it was really interesting that, they A, started talk, that's how their talk began, and B, that there was already criticism about the subject matter of their work.
I also thought that the conversation revealed really interesting comparison and contrast between the two cultures in which they were ensconced, or are ensconced. That, well, Annie Ernaux had to deal with a lot of stupid French men, and we all know how many stupid French men there are. She got other reactions, not just that, whereas Yuko Tsushima really talked about how it just was almost unanimous, the distaste or dismissiveness of the reviews that she got. If she got any attention at all, it was very, very negative, very demeaning.
Right. And I think that they touch on that as well, because of the fact that the literary critics are in Japan predominantly male. So if it didn't appeal to that crowd, then I guess either the response is going to be like, no, this isn't what we want to write about, or, we're not interested in it, or this isn't what we're going to promote. So I can see how that would have happened for Yuko Tsushima. But I was going to ask you what you thought about the comparison between the cultures and how that may have impacted their writing as well. Because they don't really touch on that in the same in a deep way, like they do very briefly.
Well, that's a very interesting question. That's probably above my pay grade, because I'm not an expert on French culture at all.
Fair enough.
I'm more familiar, but not in the same way that you are, with Japanese culture. But certainly the differences, I think, are quite obvious. That Japan is really in the dark ages when it comes to gender. That's certainly compared to Canada or France, in terms of the opportunities, even for women writers.
Yeah.
Like who else is there? I mean, now there are writers there's some that live outside of Japan, which that says a lot. But really, Yuko Tsushima of her generation is one of the only ones, and this is the kind of reception that she's got. And this is my first taste of what her reception was in Japan, because I've read her obviously in English translation, and haven't really discussed her with other Japanese readers. So,
well, I mean, her and Ernaux both speak about the idea of writing and motherhood, or writing while being at home, or being a housewife, or being in that sphere, the public sphere versus the private sphere. They talk about that both in the sense that, for women, they overlap, and women aren't able to necessarily delineate between the two as men maybe have the privilege of, but also that, to be a female writer while being a wife and mother is just, in whether you were in France or in Japan, I think they both said, it's very difficult, so that female writers are either single women, full-time writers, or are struggling writers, full-time mothers or carers, that kind of thing. And so I found that I found that actually in 2023 that's like, so there, I mean, this is 20 years old, but it's not so old to think that that's impossible. And you would probably know this much better than I would, Shawn, because you lived in Japan. But, like, I remember the idea of daycare or having babysitters or nannies, just like it was non-existent when I lived there. And the idea that mothers would eventually go back to work, re-enter the workforce where they had left, which I know is still also a problem in many other countries. I recognize that, but it was almost impossible in Japan to do that. I just found the fact that women still had to make a choice, between career and family. I found that extremely dated. And I mean, I would have been there on and off until probably the last time I went. I think it would have been 2009, 10.
It hasn't changed. It's much. There's a little bit more daycare available, but the waiting list is just like anything else you want to do in Tokyo. You can't take a number and we'll call you in 7 years. Kids will be in high school by the time the space opens up. But no, it really is the dark ages in terms of those kinds of issues. I mean, really, Japan doesn't have human rights. I mean, you have to submit a photo with your job application and you have to state your age and gender on your resume. And there's nothing preventing. I've talked to several Japanese female friends of mine who, during job interviews, they were said, "Why should I hire you? You're just going to get pregnant and have a baby, and after I've invested all this money in effort to train you up and so on." So yeah, no, it's really quite far behind the West in that way. Not in every way, but in that way, it's shockingly behind. It's like 1950s kind of attitude.
I actually read Territory of Light, which I think we talked about briefly in your 5-star project that I did, which I loved. And so this one actually is I mean, it's not so different from Woman Running in the Mountain. You have a single mother, someone who is very clearly trying to make her own way, trying to raise a child on their own. But I feel like with Territory of Light, you get so much more of the after a child has been born, a few years in, the kind of reality of the cost of raising a child, especially a child that, is needing probably a household with more than one parent, just by virtue of needing to watch a child, right? Because of course, in Territory of Light, the protagonist is a full-time employee, versus a Woman Running in the Mountain, where we only get to see her life for a short time after she gives birth. They are two different situations, but I didn't realize that abortion was legalized. I mean, obviously there were exceptions and stipulations, and there were certain, criteria that women had to meet, but it was 1948. Legalized abortion didn't happen in France until 1975. And so, you are looking at quite a big gap, even between the idea of motherhood and even questions of being able to be put in this situation or being in a situation of motherhood. So I thought that was really interesting, because I feel like Annie Ernaux's book is revolutionary, because she gets an abortion at a time when it's illegal to get an abortion. But in Woman Running in the Mountains, her family's like, just get an abortion, just get an abortion. It's like, that's 19. Right. She's writing in the late 1970s. It's a completely different, like, you're kind of thrown off guard a bit, because of course, there are so few rights that women have in Japan at that time. So it's like, whoa, it's like night and day. And if you had to sit and think about France and Japan,
that is one big difference in which Japan is much more progressive, because they don't have all that Christian BS to deal with.
So I don't know if that was something that you picked up on or something that you thought about, but I thought that was a pretty interesting thing that I kind of...
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
I was not aware that Yuko Tsushima had had a child die. I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
In more positive news, I didn't know that she has a daughter who is a writer. So that would be the third generation of an incredibly literary family, because of course Yuko Tsushima's father was the
Osamu Dazai. Osamu?
Dazai, yes, and I think even on that child. I think even Yuko Tsushima's husband or partner, whoever he was, came from a literary family. So there's all kinds of,
wow.
it's a very, very literary lineage. And
Nice.
I checked, and nothing that her daughter, it was her daughter that became aware of this interview, languishing in this Japanese literary journal, and went to the effort. And her name is Nen Ishihara.
Mm.
And so far, I couldn't find anything that she's written. She's a playwright and writer.
Okay.
That anything has been translated into English,
Translated.
but I'll sure be watching for that.
And actually, do you know, I was double checking because at the very end of that interview, when there's a little bit of a write-up, a bio about Tsushima and Ernaux, I didn't realize that Yuko Tsushima has a book coming out in 2024 called Wildcat Dome. So it's the English translation.
I didn't read the little bios at the end.
Oh, Shawn, you're missing out. So she has that coming out in 2024 posthumously, or be at least translated posthumously. I'm sure that will be something worth checking out. If readers enjoy Yuko Tsushima as a writer, I think that's something definitely that they would look forward to.
Oh, that's very exciting. Yes, that's the most exciting thing in the whole darned article, and I missed it.
Yeah. I was thinking about the 5-star reading project that I did with you, the way that I talked about Ernaux's writing style of happening. And I believe that she mentions in the article how difficult it was for her to actually publish that. And it was interesting because I thought to myself, like when we were talking, my kind of criticism was that it was very straight to the point, very factual. And it's a type of writing style that I'm not really a fan of. But when she mentioned that, I thought, shame on you, Mikiko. Like, you don't know what she was going through. Maybe that was the only way she could write about it, and she wanted to document it. But it made me think of performance and the idea of how women have to perform certain things or are expected to perform certain things, like grief, like whatever, like their own success. And it made me think again about the kind of public-private sphere, but also, how women are never really out of that private sphere. Like their private lives are always on display in a way that I don't think men's are. Like, I don't think I would talk about how a man shows grief over the loss of his son or writing about it. But yet, we talk about it with women. And I liked how Tsushima says she feels very frustrated when she goes into bookstores and sees that men's writing and women's writing are categorized differently instead of just kind of being mixed together, and how a lot of contemporary women's fiction or writing is coming out with all this pink on the covers and how it's marketed a certain way, like convenience store women. And I think that's probably one of the better covers I've seen. But if I think about things like what was recently published and it was pink and blue, is that there's no such thing as an easy job. I think that's it, where she's lying on the desk and it's all pink in the background. And I thought, so because she's a female, I don't know, Shawn. I just felt really badly.
That is one way to discuss these issues, is on that level of marketing and cover design. Absolutely. She said, didn't she say that if you go to the contemporary literature section, those are by men.
Right.
And to find any writings by women, you have to go to women's literature or women's writing. That's a age-old thing. Like, whether do you have a queer literature section or a Asian literature section in bookstores in the West? I mean, I see the pros and cons of both sides, but she's certainly making a point. And within the monolithic patriarchal culture of Japan, I can see how that would stick in her craw. Absolutely.
Yes. Well, wasn't there, I actually tried to forget about this part of the article because it was infuriating. And I think it's Yuko Tsushima who talks about it when a man in the audience makes a comment about the fact that women are kind of mollycoddled. Female writers they're kind of just, the road is paved for them. The way is just, it's all done for you. You're so kind of mollycoddled. And then all of these people in the audience started laughing before even, I think it was Tsushima could even respond. And I thought, hold on a second, like, how does he know that? How does he possibly know that? And again, to kind of assume that, he knows what it took for those women to get there. I just thought it was pretty annoying.
you wouldn't get that kind of audience reaction if it was about
Mm,
women's writing. I don't think in that context in the West, but you still get it when somebody's talking about indigenous literature or
mm.
non-white writers, other marginalized groups. Absolutely. So Yuko Tsushima gave quite a little bit of detail about maybe what was going to be her next literary project in 2004. I
Oh,
hope that she got a chance to write it, but it just sounded fascinating, and it was one of the most fascinating aspects of their conversation. She says somebody broke into her house,
yes.
and luckily for her, when the man saw that she was home, he ran away. And that very same day, she found out that one of her fellow Japanese women writers took her own life. That was
Life,
the
yeah.
same day as that she had the break in. And then later the same day, America invaded Iraq after 2001, whatever year that was, 2002 or whatever. So all of those things happened on the same day. And she
Yeah.
talked about that as the beginning of a new work. All of the events were connected by a single question. How should a woman writer live in today's day and age? How that answer will find me and where, I have no idea. And it's like, okay, now I hope she wrote that book.
I hope she did too. I hope she did as well. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. Because, I mean, that is the animating question behind so much of what they're talking about. How should a woman writer live in today's day and age?
I think what I liked as well, I wrote a note because I think Annie Ernaux jumps off on that point, from that point, talking about the idea of, what is truth in literature. And she writes about talking about the process of writing is always seeking out truth. It's something that's always evading her. And instead of ever getting at the truth, she's only ever arriving at some truth at some point in time. And then it's no longer a truth. It becomes almost false in that respect. And I thought that was a really interesting point because, of course, like even with nonfiction, you're reading these things from a certain perspective at a certain point in time in a certain place. And of course, it might be a truth for a moment or a truth for someone, but it may not be the same truth for others. But I thought it was really interesting because, of course, by women writing about those truths for them, maybe not for anybody else, means that we get to see all of the different perspectives of women writers. And I think that's the other thing that would be really interesting if we get to see that book from Tsushima, if she wrote it. It would be interesting to see how those women, maybe in those three different situations, all write about those moments and what they're going through, what their truths are in that moment. When women are able to write about that, it gives them, well, it gives them autonomy and power, but it also allows them to share that with other women who maybe wouldn't read about that or have the chance to read about that. And also maybe we're too afraid to write it. I mean, goodness knows how many women wanted to write about something but were turned away or maybe had their manuscripts turned down.
I can't believe we've gotten this far into this conversation about
That,
the dailiness of experience, and neither one of us has used the fabulous word quotidian.
ooh,
So it is a fascinating, quite lengthy interview. I recommend it to people watching highly. We only scratched the surface of all the things they
mm.
talked about. Do check it out. And Mikiko, thank you so much for talking about it with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me on again, Shawn.